So hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. Welcome to today's webinar session on clinical trials in Canada. My name is Sarah and I'm the Manager of Patient Programs, Research and Advocacy at Lymphoma Canada. And before we get started, I just wanted to know a few things for you guys before we start. One is that the webinar is being recorded. You'll receive an email with the link to the recording within a few days, and it's also going to be posted to Lymphoma Canada's website. Technically, the virtual software doesn't allow you to record or share your video or your microphone. So if you want to ask a question, please type it into the questions box in your control panel, which should be on the right-hand side of your screen. I'll ask these questions at the end of the presentation. You can type your questions during the webinar, but we'll just save them for after the presentation. And lastly but not least, I'm happy to welcome Dawn, who is the Director of Patient and Public Engagement at the nonprofit organization Clinical Trials Ontario. She's responsible for engaging patients and the public about clinical trials, including providing credible information to help patients make informed decisions about participating in novel studies. So Dawn, you can get started whenever you're ready.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sarah. And it's really my pleasure to be here today. So I'm going to start sharing my slides here. So as Sarah mentioned, we're going to talk about clinical trials in Canada. I'm going to share a number of basic things with you here. And so we'll talk about basic information related to clinical trials. We'll talk about information about finding a clinical trial, and then information for you about being a participant and maybe even choosing to leave a clinical trial, which is well within your rights. And I know that Sarah will come on at the end and talk some few specifics about lymphoma trials for you as well. So before we start, the organization that I am representing today is called Clinical Trials Ontario. You may hear me refer to it simply as CTO. And really, the bottom line is that we are primarily supported by the Ontario government, and it's really our role to help make Ontario a better place to do clinical trials. We have 3 strategic priorities, which are listed here, so to help streamline the processes related to do high-quality clinical trials, engaging patients in the public like we are today to increase awareness about trials and maybe even help you make an informed decision about participation, and lastly, promoting Ontario as a place to do clinical trials. So while I'm part of an Ontario-based organization, I would like to make it really clear that everything I'll talk about today is applicable to trials anywhere in Canada. So clinical trials are regulated from a federal level or a national level. So everything that I will talk about today is applicable no matter where you are in Canada. The presentation, the slides that I'll be working through do come from the CTO website. So if you go to www.ctontario.ca, you'll see a drop-down menu, Patients and the Public, and everything I'm going to talk about is under the Learn More about Clinical Trials section. Everything there is actually available in English and French, and we've co-created all of those Patients and Public web pages with Patients and the Public. So we want to really make sure that what we have on our website resonates with the people who will most benefit from it. And so we work collaboratively with patient and public members to do so. So let's start with some basics about clinical trials. So what are clinical trials? Maybe you've already got a notion in your head about what trials are. In their most basic definitions, they're a type of research that actually involves people. So they are experimental, that's important to know. And clinical trials test what we call health-related interventions. Intervention is a fancy word for therapies or treatments. And we also look at the outcomes related to those treatments or therapies. And we use clinical trials and we design them to answer specific questions. And we'll talk a bit about that later in terms of the different phases of trials. So they answer questions like, is the treatment safe for people to take? Does the treatment improve, or maybe it even cures disease? Or maybe it helps people live longer with the disease than other treatments that are already available. And maybe the treatment helps people feel better or have a better quality of life, like we sometimes call it. So while we often think about these health interventions or these therapies and treatments that we study in clinical trials being drugs, which are definitely one thing that we can study in clinical trials, we can also use clinical trials to look at other treatments or intervention. Could be by themselves or could be in combination with others. So these list all of the things that we can study using clinical trials. So we might use trials to study a specific device, like maybe an insulin pump or a pacemaker. Maybe it's a new type of surgery to see if it performs better. Maybe it's more cost effective than a current type of surgery. Maybe it's a new type of radiation therapy, a different type of dosing schedule related to that. Maybe it's a specific type of diagnostic procedure, like some type of imaging or other procedure. And it could even be things like diet and lifestyle. So a specific diet for a specific condition, or maybe it's even an exercise intervention. So we're going to talk today about trials related to drugs, but it's important to keep in mind that if you're looking for a trial, it might not always be drug related. So why do we do clinical trials anyway? That's an important question. Trials provide research data, or sometimes you'll hear data called evidence, and that's about the specific therapy or treatment that's being tested by the trial. And that can help a number of different people to make decisions, maybe about what therapies or other interventions might work best for people. So some of the groups or people who can use trial evidence or data to make decisions, well, it might be researchers or it might be people from industry to decide whether or not they're going to continue studying a specific type of intervention. It might be Health Canada, which is our regulator in Canada, that decides based on the data if the treatment or therapy is actually safe to be used in people, or if it actually does what it's supposed to do, so if it's got efficacy. Maybe it is policymakers or decision makers that take a look at the data and decide, for example, if it's a drug, if it's placed on a formulary, so it gets reimbursed and available to Canadians, or maybe it becomes part of treatment guidelines and clinicians use it. So there's really a number of different people that can use the data or the evidence that's generated by clinical trials to make a lot of different decisions related to that treatment or therapy. So let's demystify things a little bit and talk about the different phases of clinical trials, specifically for drugs. So I've got them listed out here, just like kind of in their most basic, but depending on the disease area, sometimes phases can be combined. Sometimes they look a little bit different from this. For example, if it's a really rare disease where there aren't a lot of people who might be able to participate in a trial, it might look really different from this as well. So these are kind of basics for you, but it might be really different based on a number of different factors related to the disease that's under study or the condition that the intervention aims at. But let's walk through these so you can learn a bit more about each one of them. Also importantly, before a drug, in this case, is taken into clinical trials, there are a number of years usually that it's under study in a lab and in preclinical research. So even though we take things into clinical trials, there might be lots of opportunity where decisions are made that things don't move on to trials in people. Or important to know that if you're considering a clinical trial, there's a lot of data that's already been gathered around, in this case, a drug before it goes into people. So just to walk you through that a little bit, the idea of laboratory research, so this is kind of where you think of scientists in the lab, they might be mixing things up, they might be doing all kinds of experiments. And you can think of that in the way of that they're discovering a new type of molecule that might become a treatment, or they've even found a new target, for example, that's related to a specific disease or condition that they might develop a new type of molecule for. Preclinical research is when they take the knowledge related to that really basic lab research and they test the intervention in specific cells, like they might be cancer cells, or they might be cells that represented different type of disease or condition, maybe tissues related to that condition, and then even animals. And so these are all called preclinical research studies because these are things that happen before the testing is done in people or in humans in the so-called clinic. So again, by the time something gets to a clinical trial phase, there's often many years and much data that's been accumulated about a specific treatment before it goes into people. We generally have an idea of how it should behave in people, but we don't actually know until the intervention is tested in people. We'll walk through this a little bit too when we talk about the phases of clinical trials. All clinical trials that happen in Canada have to be approved by Health Canada, and depending on the process, Health Canada might be looking at data while the trials are happening, or they might evaluate a package of data at a specific other time point. If Health Canada does decide that the data and evidence generated by the clinical trials make, in this case, the drug safe and efficacious, it does what it's supposed to do, they'll grant approval. And when they grant approval, that's when the treatment can become widely available to people in Canada. So just to keep in mind, there's lots of steps, there's lots of years behind this really simple diagram, but the main takeaway is, again, generally before something goes into people, there's been a lot of data and a lot of research done about that specific treatment. Okay, so now we'll look at the different phases of clinical trials for drugs. So phase 1, as I mentioned, generally is a small number of people. The goal here is to really look at the safety of the treatment. And sometimes you'll hear this called first in humans because this is the phase where this is the first time that the treatment has been used in people. We're looking at the safety, so is it safe to put into people? We look at the dose and we look at the side effect information that's generated when the treatment is used in people. And it's a small number of participants that are really closely monitored. And the same goes throughout all of the phases of clinical trials. The participants are closely monitored throughout their participation. They're often asked to provide information. It might be in the form of a diary or other ways that they provide information about their experiences. And the trial team is closely in contact with the participants and is closely monitoring them throughout the study. Now, even though the drug or hypothetical drug here has gone into a phase 1 clinical trial, it may or may not make it past phase 1. In fact, if things don't look good in terms of safety, the trial could be stopped early. Or if things look really good, the trial might be accelerated to potentially move on to another phase. So there's lots of things that impact the length of time of the phase and quite frankly, whether or not the drug in this case moves on to the next phase or not. So if the investigator or the company behind the drug, let's say it meets what's called its endpoint, so it's successful in phase 1, and they decide to move on to phase 1 clinical trial for this drug, this is where hundreds of people would be recruited to participate in the study. And here we are looking to see if the drug does what it's supposed to do. So does it act against the condition that it's meant for, how we intend it to? So that's called efficacy. And usually phase 1 studies are in people who don't live with a condition that the drug is intended for. And usually starting in phase 2, we're looking at people who live with a condition for which the drug is intended. And we continue to learn more about the appropriate dose for the drug in this case, as well as additional side effects as more participants are exposed to the drug. Larger number of participants generally takes a larger amount of time than a phase 1 study. And again, for a number of reasons, the drug may or may not move beyond phase 2 into phase 3 study. And like that could be because it hasn't met the efficacy endpoints, there's not enough money, a number of different things around this. So with our hypothetical drug, we'll say that the trials will continue beyond phase 2, and let's talk about what phase 3 studies look like. So now we're looking at the drug being taken by thousands of individuals. In this case, we're aiming to see how long the effects last. So phase 3 studies tend to be longer than phase 2 studies. And just like in phases 1 and 2, we learn more about dose, and we learn again more about the side effects as the drug is used by more and more individuals. So for a larger number of participants, and sometimes you'll hear the term randomized control trial, or RCT, and those are phase 3 studies. That's when we look at 2 or more interventions or treatment arms compared to each other. So as an example, in phase 3, we might look at if there's an existing drug that's used as a standard of care for this condition. The so-called control would be people who are taking the standard of care drug, and the intervention or treatment arm would be the people who are receiving the drug that's under study. In these randomized clinical trials, we're looking at participants being assigned by chance to one of these interventions. So that helps to reduce the bias in looking at the data related to the outcome of the study. So again, if you hear RCT, that's generally phase 3 studies, and that's when you're doing this side-by-side comparison in people who live with the condition for which the drug is intended. So with our hypothetical drug, assuming that the phase 3 data looks great, it's doing what it's supposed to do, it's safe, we know what the dose is. In fact, it's outperforming the standard of care, and people seem to be better or doing better taking that particular drug. In this case, the investigator or the sponsor might choose then to apply to Health Canada so that they can have the drug approved, basically, so that it can be marketed and widely available to people who live in Canada. And then phase 4 clinical trials for drugs happen in thousands of people. And this is when the drug is approved by Health Canada, it's allowed to be sold or marketed and widely available. So sometimes it's also called post-marketing surveillance studies because Health Canada has approved it, and this is after it becomes marketed and available to a large number of people. Again, we use this to look at really the long-term side effects and the safety of the drug in this case in people. And large number of participants, if there are tens of thousands of people So you can think of it in terms of like the COVID vaccines, right? Right now they're undergoing this phase 4 study where they're in thousands of people, if not millions of people, and we can really look at the longer term side effects in a huge number of people. So those are kind of the generalities of those different phases of clinical trials, and you can see that each of those different phases we design to specifically answer specific questions about, in this case, the drug, or it could be another intervention. Sometimes I get asked about placebo, and you may recall me talking about phase 3 studies where when there's actually a good standard of care that's out there already, people would not be randomized to a placebo arm versus a treatment arm. That wouldn't be considered ethical. And what is a placebo anyway? A placebo is something that looks just like the active therapy, but it's actually inactive. It shouldn't have any effect on the condition that's being studied. Sometimes you hear this called a sugar pill or something like that. So if it's a drug, or if it's being stacked up against a drug, it would look the exact same as the drug, right down to like if there's any stamp on it or whatnot. And just like randomization, this is used to make the results of the study more reliable, less biased when we look at the data. And as I mentioned, it's important that if there's not a standard of care for a condition or disease, then placebo might be used in phase 3 studies. But if there is a standard of care already, then the treatment would be randomized against that standard of care. So those are kind of the basics about clinical trials themselves. Let's move on to finding a clinical trial. So if you're interested in a clinical trial, there's different things you might do. You might choose to talk to a healthcare provider. Some are really knowledgeable about trials and can help you out in that way. Part of why you're probably at this presentation is you know that Lymphoma Canada has resources that can help you, and I know Sarah will talk to you about that a bit later in the webinar. You can contact a hospital or another organization that does research and ask them about their clinical trials and what they have going on. There are legitimate ads in the newspaper, TV, or radio that you might hear. Oftentimes those are for phase 1 trials, and you might hear that there's a payment associated with that. And that's considered ethical because if you'll remember, phase 1 trials is typically when the intervention is tested for the first time in people. And so those people are taking potentially a larger risk than people in subsequent phases of clinical trials. And so they may be offered compensation for their participation in a study. I'll pop this into the chat a bit later. Clinical Trials Ontario has worked in collaboration with patient organizations and health charities and public members to develop a clinical trial finder. And there you can look for a trial anywhere in Canada, or you can narrow it down to within so far from your postal code or within a certain province or territory. And I know Sarah will also talk to you about some other resources that Lymphoma Canada has that can help you as well. So there's a few different ways you can go about finding a clinical trial, and it might just be up to you and what your comfort level is with these different ways. There are questions to ask about whether or not a trial is actually credible or reputable. These are some of the things that really come to mind first of all, and that is that all of the costs of the trial should be covered. So you should not be asked to pay to access the intervention. You might be asked to pay for parking to get to the clinical trial site, which sometimes can also be reimbursed. You may have to take time off work, or your time is valuable, so that could be considered a cost. But you should not be asked for like an entrance fee to the study or to cover the costs related to the intervention. Those are pretty big red flags. You should look at the qualifications of the clinical trial team. So Has this group of individuals been studying in this area? They have a track record in this area of and maybe in this case it's a type of lymphoma. You know, are they affiliated with an academic institution? They don't have to be, but sometimes that's something to look for. As I mentioned earlier, in Canada, all clinical trial applications have to be reviewed and approved by Health Canada. And that's something you can ask the trial team. They should have no issue responding to that question if it's a legitimate study. You can ask if the clinical trial has been reviewed and approved by a research ethics board. So again, all trials have to be reviewed and approved by a research ethics board, and they're looking at it from the perspective of participant rights and safety, so welfare of participants. And then also clinical trials have to be reviewed and approved by the institution or organization where they're taking place. So there's a liability associated with doing clinical trials. There's insurance that's in place. And so that's another thing you can ask. Again, these might seem like strange questions to ask. You know, you might be more interested in some of the logistical questions, again, that I know Sarah is going to cover later on. But if you're concerned about if the trial is a legit study, these are things you should ask, and the trial team should not be offended by you inquiring about these types of things. So this, you'll notice, is really similar to the last slide, and that's, you know, only you can determine if a clinical trial is a good fit for you. And the first 5 questions or points are really the same as the last slide. The last point is that even if you determine that, yeah, this seems like a credible trial, I'm interested in it, you do need to meet what's called the eligibility criteria for the clinical trial. And you can think of that as kind of a set of criteria that you need to meet in order to be in the study. So it might be that you're not taking a certain type of medication. Maybe you have to live within X kilometers of the study site. Maybe you have to be a male or female. So there's going to be a list of eligibility criteria. So you'll have to see if you meet those criteria in order to be part of the study. And usually when you inquire about this, the study team will go over that with you as well. Clinical trials aren't the only option. They're one of the options. And there's other options here. Just a few of them are listed. There might be other options. One might be receiving no treatment. Another one might be receiving standard treatment or maybe a different form of treatment than what you're currently on. Or maybe you want to participate in a different research study altogether. These are all going to have potential benefits and risks associated with them. And probably speaking to your healthcare provider, might be your physician, might be someone else, about what the potential benefits and risks of these are, including no treatment, would be helpful for you. So there's really lots of things to think about, and clinical trials aren't the only option. So what if you're interested so that you can't even find a clinical trial? There's a few options there for you to consider too. One is if the trial isn't close to you, but you're still interested in it, I'd encourage you to contact the study team. There still might be a possibility for you to participate in the study, and this might affect you, and it's good for you to find out logistically what that would mean. Would that mean you would have to pay for transportation, or could that be covered? That can be the case sometimes. How far away would you have to go? How much time would this take for you? And depending on your situation, you know, and the responses you get there, that trial might be right for you. There might be ways to bring trials closer to you. So there might be ways that you can work with your healthcare team or providers to open up a new site. I'll be honest with you, that could take time and a lot of time and a lot of energy. So that might not be an option for you, but it is a possibility. I've known other patients who have watched trials become available in other locations first, and then just checked from time to time in different clinical trial finders until that trial actually came to a location that was closer to them. So part of it depends on where you live, and part of it is about just keeping up to date on what's going on and seeing if being part of research is an option for you. It's interesting too, during the pandemic, ways have been found to help people participate in different ways than would traditionally happen. So people that aren't close to sites may have been able to participate, and a lot of what used to have to be done in person, at least at the start of the pandemic, was moved to virtual settings. And so again, there might be more options now that we've lived for a few years in a slightly more virtual world. It's important to know that even if your healthcare provider offers you a clinical trial, you don't have to say yes. Again, I'll come back to this as a really personal decision for you, and you don't have to say yes, and this should not affect your relationship or your treatment with your healthcare provider, no matter what your decision is there. I'm going to wrap up with a few slides about participating in or withdrawing from a clinical trial. These are important things to know in terms of your rights as a participant and as a volunteer in clinical trials. So first of all, there's this thing called informed consent, and a lot of people tend to think of informed consent being an actual document that's provided to you. That is one part of informed consent, but informed consent is actually a process. So informed consent is voluntary. It's up to you whether or not you wish to be in a clinical trial. You can revoke that consent at any time. So even if you have initially decided, I'd like to be part of this study, and for whatever reason you change your mind, you can withdraw. As I mentioned, consent is an ongoing process. So it's about, if you've decided to be in the trial, asking questions throughout the trial to make sure that you know what your responsibilities are being a participant, and being sure that you're okay with what's expected of you. If you do decide to withdraw consent, you can also request that any data you've provided to the team or any biological samples that you've provided to the team can also be removed from the study. That may or may not be possible. You'll find out when you ask, but you can definitely ask. I think we've mentioned this. There are potential benefits and risks to any clinical trial. It's up to you to decide if you feel like the potential benefits outweigh the potential risks. All of the potential risks and benefits will be different because each clinical trial is different, and they will be described in the informed consent form that you're asked to go through, and the clinical trial team will go through with you as well at the start of discussions about your participation. And you should really feel confident in asking any and all questions about potential benefits and risks and anything else related to the trial until you feel like you've got those answered in a way that is understandable to you and that makes sense to you. So you can leave a clinical trial at any time. You don't have to provide any kind of reason, but you may be asked for a reason, or you might be asked to share information about your experiences in the trial. You are encouraged to talk to the study team before you make that decision. So as part of informed consent, ask lots of questions, make sure that you're, good with your decision to withdraw, and that is the decision that you would like to make. As I mentioned, you might be asked questions about your experience, and you might even be asked to take tests depending on what the trial is, or have a physical exam, and that's really about your safety and being sure that you can stop the study safely. So it might not be as simple as just walking away from the study. That's part of also asking questions and finding out what it looks like to leave the trial. And of course, as I mentioned previously, you can ask to withdraw your any data that you provided and any samples. Maybe it's a urine sample, a blood sample, something else, any information that was collected about you. And that may or may not be possible for a number of reasons. And of course, I would encourage you to ask about that if that's important to you, and make sure you understand the possibilities around that. So I'm going to wrap up. I'll just remind you that all of the information that I've talked about is on our website under the Patients and Public section. Again, everything that I've talked about, even though we're an Ontario-based organization, is applicable to trials all over Canada. So no matter where you are. And I'm now going to pass it off to Sarah and just advance her slides for her as she goes through things, and happy to take questions at the end. So Sarah, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Dawn. I think you've provided a great presentation so far. I just want to highlight a few specific things in the next few slides of more ways that you can access clinical trials, and provide some ways that specifically lymphoma patients and caregivers can look for them as well. So one of the great resources that I always get recommended by doctors and healthcare professionals is to look at clinicaltrials.gov. So you can type that into your search bar. And here you'll be able to find clinical trials all over the world, but you can filter them specifically based upon the country, so Canada and your city, just below the country title there. And furthermore, it's important to filter based upon your lymphoma subtype. So this could be diffuse large B cell, it could be mantle cell lymphoma. You can get as specific as you want here, and it'll bring up a search bar. And then you can also type in any other terms. So if you say, for instance, know the drug name of you're looking for a specific clinical trial, you can type that also in this program here. And then Donna, if you just want to go to the next slide, I have an example of what this might look like. So on the left-hand side, you can filter by the status of the clinical trial. So you can show that if there's one up and coming, they might not be recruiting yet, but you can still access that information. I recommend specifically if you are interested in enrolling in a clinical trial, to either click on recruiting or enroll by invitation. And that's the easiest ways to see which ones are active and going on right now that you might be able to participate in. And then you'll also be able to see the study title. So usually that will indicate the specific lymphoma subtype and also the drug that's being questioned for the clinical trial. And as soon as you click that blue title, you should be able to get all the access information on the website, which includes the locations of where you actually can find these clinical trials near you. Next slide. Sorry, Dawn, can you just go to the next slide?
It's showing on my screen, Sarah, that it is the clinical trial navigation. Are you not seeing it?
Yeah, no, I got it now. It was just delayed.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you to play it just in 1 sec to see if the video works well. So this is a clinical trial navigation system, and you can find it at the website just below the screen there. And ASH, which is the American Society of Hematology, and the Leukemia Society, which is an organization in the US, they actually installed or created this clinical trial navigation system. It's all based upon the US, and the doctor has to initiate it, but as soon as it's initiated by a doctor who would be an ASH member in Canada, you can get Canadian specific information. So Dawn, if you want to try the video.
Okay, I'm going to press play.
Okay. I can't hear it yet. Maybe it's because of your headphones.
To help overcome barriers for physicians and their patients that may impede clinical trial enrollment. What began as a pilot project between ASH and LLS's Clinical Trial Support Center, or CTSC, is now being made widely available to ASH members and their patients for free. This service, staffed with highly trained clinical trial nurse navigators, helps to provide you and your patients with individualized information about appropriate clinical trials to facilitate productive discussions between the patient and the healthcare team. This process involves ongoing interaction between the ASH members, the patient, and the CTSC nurse navigators. As an ASH member, you will initiate the connection with the nurse navigator through the submission of an electronic referral form. Let's walk through the process of referring your patient to the CTSC. First, start by having a conversation with your patient about potential therapeutic interventions that may be possible through clinical trial participation. Explain to the patient that they're being referred to LLS's CTSC for assistance with a clinical trial search and support. Then log on to the ASH portal using your single sign-on. Download the HIPAA authorization form for your patient to sign and store this signed document within your practice. Next, indicate how many patients you'll be referring at this time. You will then be prompted to complete a referral form for each patient. Please fill out as much information as you can provide. Once you've submitted the form, a nurse navigator will contact the patient within 1 to 2 business days following form submission. If a patient's email address is included in the form, the patient will automatically receive an email confirmation that the referral was submitted. If the trial search is urgent, submit the referral form and send a follow-up email to ctsc@lls.org, notifying the CTSC of the urgent request. After the nurse navigator reviews the referral and speaks with the patient, the CTSC will provide a list of appropriate clinical trials to both you and your patient via email. Please discuss this list of provided clinical trials with your patient to determine the most appropriate one and inform the CTSC of the decision reached. It is important to close the loop with the CTS nurse navigator about what the patient has decided. The nurse navigator will continue to be a resource for the patient as he or she moves through the clinical trial enrollment process. When you are ready to refer another patient at a later date, log into the ASH portal using your ASH single sign-on and complete the referral form process again. You will not have to view this educational video before making additional referrals. However, if you would like to view it again, it is accessible in the resources section on the ASH website. ASH and LLS are excited to offer this program to benefit patients with blood cancers by increasing access to clinical trials. If you have any questions on the process, don't hesitate to contact ASH or LLS staff. All contact information can be found in the resources section after exiting this video. Thank you for being a part of this groundbreaking collaboration between the American Society of Hematology and the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society Clinical Trial Support Center.
So yeah, again, that was just, the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society is an organization in the U.S., but Canadian doctors, if you're going to see your doctor and they don't know what clinical trials are available, this is something that you could possibly show them, and then get access and be in conversation with that nurse to find a clinical trial that's near you. So if you want to go to the next slide, Don.
The American Society of Hematology.
Awesome, thank you. And I just wanted to also point out that on our website, lymphomacanada.ca, if you go to the second tab under patient experience and then taking control, there is a section and a lot of this information that we've talked about today about clinical trials, some of the eligibility requirements, and just all the information that we've talked about today. And if you just want to go to the next slide, in that website, we have a list of questions that you can bring to your doctor or your clinical trial team to ultimately have a checklist and make sure that you have all the information prepared before you enter one or decide to enter one. And I believe that's the end of the presentation, but if you want to go to the next slide, this is when we're going to answer your questions. Thank you for everyone for listening. Again, you can type your questions into the question box in your control panel, and we'll try to answer as many as possible. So there has been a few that come in since we presented. One is, if you are on a clinical trial, do they ever stop the trial? And if they do, what happens to the person who is on that trial? Dawn, did you want to answer this one? Oh, I can't hear you, Dawn. I think you're muted.
How's that?
That's good. Awesome.
Sorry, can you repeat the question? I was having some technical difficulties.
Yeah, no problem. So if you are on a clinical trial, do they ever just stop the trial? And if they do, what happens to that person who is on the trial?
So that's a good question. There could be a number of reasons why a clinical trial might stop before it's supposed to. So some of those I chatted about a bit, where it would be unethical to continue the trial, for example, if there are great results that are happening. So they might stop the trial early in that case, or it might also be unethical to continue a trial if they're monitoring the study and they see that, for example, there's a lot of side effects or things are not happening as anticipated. So it's going to be different for each study depending on what the study is and what it looks like in terms of what stopping looks like. And that should be something that is clearly explained by the trial team. And depending on the phase of the study and what is happening to participants, the team would make sure that it's stopped as safely as possible. So just like withdrawal, there might be some tests done, or people who are participating might be asked for specific information, and the goal obviously would be to make sure that people are able to stop the trial safely.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. And I think it's something also you can talk specifically with your doctor about for whatever the specific trial is, because again, I'm sure there's multiple ways of, if the clinicians usually have an approach of like, if this needs to be stopped, then something else will happen.
Yeah.
Another question is, does BC have something like this in Ontario, like Ontario does? And I assume that they mean a nonprofit organization.
Right. I think so too. So I'm going to go with that assumption. There actually is, under the BC Academic Health Sciences Network, there is a like organization called Clinical Trials BC. They're not exactly like CTO, but they do provide support in terms of helping build capacity with clinical trial professionals in BC and building the environment in BC for clinical trials. So you can Google either the BC Academic Health Sciences Network or Clinical Trials BC, and you can find out more information. I'm also happy to put you in contact with someone there if that doesn't work for you. So you can always contact Sarah, and she can be sure that I get your information and help you out.
Yeah, for sure. You can email me at sarah@lymphoma.ca. But yeah, I do know that BC Cancer has a lot of great resources about clinical trials. So yeah, it's very province dependent as well.
Yeah.
There hasn't been any other questions in the chat. Maybe I'll just give it a few more minutes in case anyone else wants to answer another question. I did learn a few things during the presentation myself that I didn't know about clinical trials, which is interesting.
What did you learn, Sarah?
I learned that people can actually pay for the first phase of a clinical trial. And I thought that at first you were going to say, oh, it's not, but I didn't actually know that myself. So it was interesting. And it makes sense that like at the first phase of a clinical trial that there's just a risk and like a benefit of any decision that you make. So I found that interesting. So someone is asking in the chat about a second opinion about another doctor. I guess, about receiving clinical trials or enrolling in one. Dawn, do you know anything about how, like, seeking a second opinion from a doctor if you're considering a clinical trial?
Yeah, I think I would just like to emphasize that speaking to whoever you trust about potential participation is important. I do know some individuals who have talked to their physicians who haven't necessarily been supportive of clinical trials, and then they've gone on to talk to other people, including their family, and they've simply decided that being part of a trial is important for them. So it really is a personal decision, and so that's really up to you to decide who you need to talk to and what that means for you. I can't impose anything on you about that, but I think the key thing is to, if you're interested, to keep exploring and asking questions until you feel satisfied about something. And physicians are people too. They may or may not agree with your decisions, but the decision really is yours.
I agree, for sure. And I think that specifically the comment about the U.S., it's just something to talk to your doctor about the options of traveling, whether that's out of province or out of the country, depending on where you live. So it's definitely still a discussion to have with your family physician or like at your treatment center, if that's something that feels safe and practical for you to do while you're seeking lymphoma treatment. I think those are all the questions for now. There was just a comment that wanted to thank everyone during this presentation, and they just mentioned that it's very valuable for clinical trials. It's the reason that they're here today. So thank you very much for that comment. I think that I've talked with a lot of patients myself, and I think that novel therapies are really exciting and very new right now, especially in like the immuno and the cellular therapy area. So I know there's a lot of good hope for lymphoma patients and caregivers in the near future. So thank you again for presenting, Dawn. And if there's any further questions, just email me at info@lymphoma.ca, and Dawn and I will be able to get that question answered for you. Okay?
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for inviting me, Sarah.
No problem. Have a great evening.